I told you that I want you to learn the last part of the book of Acts. So what we're going to see is when we step into the third journey and the move towards Rome, it is so easy to get lost. I want to show you something. I've always found this interesting, okay? And you will find this true in most commentaries. Let me show you something. This is very interesting to me. This first part of the book, commentary, this is box commentary. First part of the book, chapter 1 through 18, really through the second missionary journey. Third missionary journey in the last part of the book, right here. I'm trying to make a point for us. It's not just because Dr. Bach was tired when he got to the end and just had only a few pages left. It is because I think Luke does something different. He is not spending as much time on purpose, even though we have 10 chapters from 18 through the end, right? You see where I'm going with this? It jumps into narrative history and we are on the move. As a matter of fact, the dominant teaching that we have is in this first 18 chapters of the book. If I was to pause and say, hey, we're going to discuss the big teaching chapters out of the book of Acts, you know what we would probably say? Chapter 2. Now that's huge, right? You got to talk about Pentecost. Chapter 7. I mean, you get into the first martyr. That's a critical chapter. Chapter 9. We see Saul come into a relationship with Jesus Christ. Chapter 10. Oh, the house of Cornelius. That's huge. Chapter 15. It's enormous, right? The Jerusalem Council. 17. He slows down again, what we just talked about. Okay. What we begin to see is a level of repetition. Paul goes into a city. He shares. Persecution is real. Paul is taken into captivity, meaning he goes into prison or to jail. Sometimes he's released. There are various levels of persecution. Paul shares his story. Chapter 9, where is it reiterated? Chapter 22, chapter 26. We have all of these Roman cycles of the judicial system. For me, 20 years ago, there came something out that was called the Visual Bible. If you do not know about it, you're in for a treat. Okay? This is what this is. It is the book of Acts, NIV, word for word, that's lived out on the big screen. Okay? It helps you see it. And one of the things that I think you will appreciate, it helped me actually get my arms around all of the moves, in particular towards that march to Rome. Okay? So this is going to take about an hour. So get your popcorn ready and all that kind of stuff. Okay? Kick back. Try to stay awake. Okay? There's a little bit of cheese in it. Okay? So, you know what I'm saying? I get it. It's, you know, it was a good budget, but it wasn't a full-blown Hollywood budget. Okay? But I'm telling you, there's actually some pretty big name stars that were involved in this one. Okay? So, but I think it will help you see the move towards Rome in particular. So we're going to zip through. You're going to watch it all. It's going to take probably an hour, hour and 10 minutes, something like that. Here's what I want you to know about this. As we're starting in, if you're going to not follow along, because I'm going to have to turn the lights off to see this, but literally, friends, this is word for word from the NIV. So every word that you hear of what you see is nothing but biblical text. There's nothing else added other than you have acting to tell the narrative. Okay, now one thing that you need to know, this is told from the vantage point of Luke as the author of Acts. So you're going to see Luke on a couple occasions and you'll hear his voice. There's a consistent voice because it is portrayed as Luke as the narrator. Does that make sense? As he is recounting and it's showing him. So you're going to see him a couple of scenes like it's Luke on a boat, okay, as he's traveling in some of these missionary journeys where he himself participates. And so you'll see this individual. You'll start knowing who Paul is and who Luke is, because Luke is the narrator. You'll see him in different scenes, kind of this crazy, wild-haired looking kind of guy, and you'll hear his voice. So you have to jump into the storyline. It's actually of the whole book, but we're just going to jump in at chapter 18, and then I'll make some comments about that. it helped me tremendously years ago, because when you get to the end of this book, it takes a rapid pace, and you read from one town to the next, to the next, to the next, and then you get into the Roman trials system. But when I saw this visually, I want you to know there was one part of that I am incredibly moved, and part of this is because I'm a very visual person. There is a moment in that presentation before King Agrippa that is incredibly moving. And I think that's hopeful for us to see, because we begin to see the passion of this man named Paul that we've been making this journey with. And he made it. The gospel of Jesus Christ was taken to the peasant and the highest ranking officials of Rome. He made it. Now, that epilogue, it's giving us a little insight, because I do believe, as I told you this, that I think Paul was released. We have the writings, what we call the pastorals, which we'll deal with next week. But there's something very moving about the end of this book, because Paul's on a journey. And he had one goal, and that was to share the Lord Jesus. I told you there was one tension, and you probably saw it in chapter 21, that I want you to wrestle with. And we have a guest that is going to join us, and I am thrilled about that. We are going to take a 5-minute break only. We will come back in 5 minutes, and we are going to have a fascinating discussion related to chapter 21, but it is a theme that we have wrestled with all the way through the book, and it is this tension of Jew and Gentile relationships. But in particular, you saw in chapter 21, even in this presentation here, of Paul taking vows, and Paul still living in relationship to his Jewish brethren, by the way, which ultimately he was on trial for, right? We saw that. But in terms of Mosaic tradition, how far can Jewish individuals continue to move forward, if I can phrase it this way, without crossing a line because of who now this Jesus is? We're going to come back and talk about that with a very special friend that's been with us at Dallas Seminary for the last year, but will be finishing, at least in this capacity, and is going to be leaving here next week. But we were able to sneak him in here for the next 30 minutes. I am joined here by Vladimir Pickman, who has been with us at Dallas Seminary for the last year. He's a graduate of DTS and has been with us the last year, serving in a very unique capacity. Every year we have someone that is present as what is called missionary in residency. And so Vladimir has joined us in that capacity for this last year, and it's just been a wonderful year in that regard. And believe it or not, this was not planned this morning, but in light of some of our discussions yesterday, I thought it would be very appropriate, knowing also what we were going to see here. I want to set the scene a little bit, and let me go back again into Acts chapter 21, because this is probably where it shows up. But I want us to see, this has been a theme that we've been wrestling with for really 3 days, of this Jewish community that through the promises of their forefathers, the great covenants, when the early group that comes to faith in Christ, accepting Christ and believing that He is the Messiah, that from that point forward we start seeing this tension that, to be honest, none of us really fully understand. That the Jewish people that became believers in Jesus, with others in the Jewish faith that were not believers in Jesus, the circumcised, within that group there were those that were believers in Christ. And so this tension that we see, so we understand how that butts up against, well, what about the Gentiles? When the Lord opens up the heavens and shows that, as we discussed yesterday in the house of Cornelius, that makes complete sense to us. So we concluded, in other words, out of the Council of Jerusalem in chapter 15, to use that language that we're solidifying, that Gentiles did not have to become Jewish in order to become Christians. Circumcision was, if it was identified as the sign of the covenant, that they were not required, and we saw that pronouncement came out of chapter 15. You saw some things in what we just watched that were a little peculiar, and I want to read it again so we can see it. And Vladimir, I thought it would be fascinating with who you are and your background and involvement in Jewish ministries to give some comments on this, and it will help us tremendously. But listen to this. So this is at the end of missionary journey number 3. So Paul returns to Jerusalem. Paul does. Now listen to the language again. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. So let's not forget this. They were all excited. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law." James seems to be making a point, because remember, where is James again? Where are we back? What city? We're in Jerusalem. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses. Notice the language. The report is, word on the street is that to all of the Jews that live among the Gentiles, you command them to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. So notice what is identified here. To turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children and live according to our customs. What shall we do? That was a powerful moment in what we watched, by the way. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everybody will know that there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. Now, if you just heard that and pulled it out of context without the book of Acts as a whole, we might go, what is going on here? I mean, why is Paul being told by James to revert back to the law? Now listen close again. Verse 25. As for the Gentiles, believers, we have written to them about our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. He is repeating that from where? Acts chapter 15, Jerusalem Council. Okay, so here's the question that is in front of us. Paul is at home in Jerusalem. There's word on the street. The Gentiles have been brought into this grand plan of God, as was promised all the way back in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. But Paul is asked to continue, in light of his relationship in the Jewish community, with practices or customs within the Jewish teachings. And vows are brought up, and an act of purification is brought up. So, Vladimir, help us a little bit and to think through this, because with your background in Jewish studies and in Jewish ministries, and with who you are from a Jewish perspective, an individual that claims Jesus as Messiah, where is the line, if I can phrase it that way, of Jewish tradition as it even relates to the Mosaic covenant and practices within Jewish culture, but it doesn't cross that line of seeing salvation through the Old Testament covenant, the Mosaic covenant? That's a big question here, because you see the tension in the text in the book of Acts where James says to Paul, hey, go through parts of Jewish custom and tradition so that you do not lose your effectiveness in ministry and working in a Jewish context. Any thoughts that you have about that?
Well, what we see here in the book of Acts regarding Paul and generally, it's more like his testimony. As we know from Acts chapter 1:8, very famous verse, that you will receive the Holy Spirit, the power, and you will be my witnesses. So it's about the witness of Paul.
Right.
He brings constantly in every city he comes, in every situation, he seems to bring certain witness. And the overarching witness of Paul in the book of Acts is generally very Jewish.
Right.
Seriously, he comes to a city, he goes to a synagogue,
Into the synagogue.
he enters a synagogue, and they see him there, and they immediately tell, oh, come and teach us. There is something, even in the way Paul looked like, for them to immediately recognize him as somebody who is to be invited to teach. So he was like talking like military language. He was like in certain dress with certain, how you call it in English, like certain signs of his military status that they saw him, and they immediately were asking him, teach us. And he got freedom to teach for hours in every synagogue. So his lifestyle was very Jewish in many different aspects. We cannot build any theology, in my personal opinion, based upon what Paul was doing. That we cannot come to the immediate conclusion, or every Messianic Jew, or every Jewish believer in Jesus is to live this way. But at least we can consider the testimony of Paul. For me, as somebody who is involved in sharing the gospel with the Jewish people, and also doing everything possible to communicate the Jesus, Yeshua, as the Messiah of Israel to his original receivers, so to speak. For me, Paul is very important personality to communicate to the Jewish people. Today, there is a growing sympathy regarding Jesus. So Jesus, among Jewish people, Jesus is recognized as somebody like he's one of us. He's a Jewish guy. He's a good teacher. Different Jewish scholars, they write a very nice thing about Jesus this day. Even Orthodox Jews, liberal Jewish scholars. But the Apostle Paul is a bad guy, the one who just destroyed everything. Jesus' teaching was good. The Paul was the evil one, because Jesus was Jewish, or is Jewish. The Paul, the Gentile, he became a Gentile, and he actually mixed everything up. So he just turned the Christianity that was originally like Jesus teaching Jewish type of sect, or certain type of Judaism, he turned it over and made it Gentilish. So he was the one who was teaching Jewish people to become as Gentiles. That's the general assumption among the Jewish people. So this passage from Acts chapter 21 is very important for the apologetic of the New Testament, as talking to the Jewish people as well. And unfortunately, the Apostle Paul is very often misunderstood in his teaching. In theology today, there is like terminology, new perspective on Paul. Sure. And this new perspective is mostly regarding Gentiles and his teaching. But before coming to his teaching, we need to understand, we need to get perspective on Paul personally, who he was and what was his lifestyle. Here, he was accused that he is teaching the Jewish people, nothing about Gentiles, but the Jewish people who are living among the Gentiles. So in the diaspora, he was accused to teach them to stop observing the law, to stop circumcision, to abandon the patristic or the ancestral traditions.
Right.
And actually it meant just he was making them as Gentiles. He was bringing them out of the Jewish people. So it was like more even ethnic than believing issue here. Just if you took I don't know about this class, but if you know the stories in the Second Temple period and even before, there were attempts to destroy the Jewish people or to make them totally assimilated by even prohibiting in the book of Maccabees. It's very evident by prohibiting them to circumcise, to observe the law, and to keep their tradition. So here, the Paul is accused of doing the same.
So think of how fresh that is in their history, if I can phrase it that way, of how fresh this is in Jewish history. Here we have someone that was raised in Pharisaical traditions. We've already crossed that with knowing Paul. Would have been identified as such. He goes into the synagogues. We know his practices. But so I think it's important for us to see the issue that we have in chapter 21, if we can phrase it that way. It's ultimately not related to the Gentiles. This is an issue related to, there was a perspective of Paul that he was teaching Jews not to have any Jewish identity. Is that fair?
Yeah, right. They were actually, Paul was, that was an accusation.
Yes.
And James is asking Paul to indicate, to prove, to show, or to testify that it's not true. Actually, in this is the point here. Actually, James seems to trust Paul that Paul is not doing that. But he says that there are many Jewish people who heard the rumors that Paul is the evil one, the Paul is the Gentile, like a Gentilizer, somebody who proselytizes the Jewish people. The Paul was actually very much willing to show that it's not true. That's what he did here. It was, again, his testimony. Everything what you heard about me as the proselytizer of the Jewish people in the diaspora is not true. And I'm taking this vow, I'm bringing this sacrifice. It's my promise. It's my testimony. It's like I swear that it's not true. Paul's testimony here is somebody who is keeping with the line of his Jewish lifestyle. And I would say sometimes there is, in many cases, there is a perspective that Paul was here just a Jew to the Jews. But then he went like to Athens or whatever other city, and he was like extremely Gentilish immediately. So he took his Jewish garments away and he became like the Gentile. So Greek for the Greeks, Jew for the Jews. I would call it hypocrisy. So I think it's not possible here. But if you want to compare this passage, there is another passage that is very interesting. Have you studied already Acts chapter 28?
We just went through everything.
Okay,
feel free to
good.
reference that at the end. Sure.
So just let's look at the chapter 28, verse 17, if you would. Paul is in Rome. He's calling Jewish leaders together. And when they had assembled, he said to them, "Brothers, although I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our ancestors." At the very end of his life, his testimony is the same. He repeats it a couple of times during the book of Acts. Actually, when you study his epistles, you will see the same.
Yes.
He says, "I'm Jew. I never broke anything with anything in the traditions. In fact, and sometimes he says, I'm a Pharisee." It's usually translated like I was a Pharisee. I would challenge that. He still remains part of a certain Jewish religious cultural perspective. Pharisees were very open for Jesus, actually, besides some of their leadership. But anyway, it's another subject. At the very end of his life in Rome, Paul is testifying again that he has, with the same terminology, the same words like customs of the ancestors, as in Acts chapter 21. He testifies, I have never done anything against that. So the testimony of Paul was distinctively Jewish. And even the Gentiles could see that. If you remember, Paul was coming to a city, it was probably Ephesus, and he was teaching there. Gentiles were becoming believers. The merchants, pagan merchants, they were seeing that they are losing their profit, and they were accusing the Jewish people of doing something wrong. So they started a pogrom of the synagogue because they thought that Paul is the Jew who tries to convert the Gentiles into the Judaism. So it was rather misunderstanding on that part than on a Jewish part. Paul looked very Jewish, and his testimony was very much so. So, making a parallel with the Messianic movement, today. What we read here, it's not the matter of certain theology. It's Paul's life testimony. We need to consider that as doing our theology, but beyond that, our testimony to the Jewish people in the current world, or in the world at the present, is to be probably as authentic as the Paul. So we need to emphasize as Jewish believers that we are not proselytizing. We are not bringing Jewish people to a different God, and for God's sake, never bring our people to break with the Jewish people. So it's very important in some Jewish people, some Jewish believers, they keep more of the law, some less. But in any case, our testimony should be coming to Jesus. We're not coming to different God, and we're not breaking with our people by doing that. In fact, we're getting even more. We are coming to the fulfillment of our Jewish calling. And as I would say probably in my testimony, before I believed in Jesus, being Jewish for me was a matter of destiny. Just, I'm Jewish, no escape. Like, it's my destiny. After I believed in Yeshua, I understood my calling. So now for me, being Jewish, probably the same as for Paul, it's a matter of calling and not just destiny.
Let me make two observations here. Number one, I think if we can tie this into the book, I think something that I see into the book of Acts, and this is where, when I say watching that, helped me, I do think that there is something that we are seeing a pattern in the book showing a defense. If this thing wraps up at the end like it does, Paul is in bondage, if you can phrase that way. He has a level of freedom that we have where he is in Rome. But if the charge and the accusation in his appeal to Caesar as a Roman citizen, all of this was wrapped up in, did he or did he not break Jewish tradition? Does that make sense? All of this, the accusation. In fact, some of them are like, did you hear in the last statement? It comes across very clear. It's obviously right out of the text. But King Agrippa, what did he say? And they showed that scene walking down. He said, hey, this man should have been let go had he not done what? Appealed to Caesar. Paul knew exactly what he was doing, though, because he desired that gospel to get to Rome. Okay, so if we understand that the book wraps up and there is some level of a defense that is being argued throughout the purpose of the book. Remember when I told you this at the beginning of it? I said, look, I think Theophilus is a real person. Okay? I actually think he is a Gentile Roman official, is what I think. Paul is, when it wraps up, he's telling the story, and he's saying, hey, Theophilus, you've come to faith. And by the way, that wouldn't surprise me. I think we're going to find out someday Theophilus came to faith because of Paul. That's what I think. Okay? It's my own hunch. I want to find that one out someday. But I think that when this life of Paul that we see, it wraps up in, while this is the story, the history of Christianity that we have, the workings of God, the sovereignty of God, it's also a defense telling Paul's story. Why is he there in prison? And guess what? The one thing that he's accused of? No, he's a Jew's Jew. Does that make sense? But he sees the role of the Messiah as the fulfillment of all of Judaism. Okay, now, I think that's part of how we can wrap up the book of Acts. But I want to ask some real practical questions, because you used a phrase a minute ago that you say, some Jews today execute and carry out parts of the law more than others. Messianic Jews, where is Jewish tradition and practice in terms of what we reference as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, if I can phrase it that way, is that in terms of you as a Jewish believer in Yeshua, what practices, where is Jewish tradition, and where does it cross a line, if you will, into bad theology? Because if Jesus is the fulfillment, so in other words, when we start thinking about sacrifices, because we get in a little tension there, don't we, in the text. Paul goes, and by the way, in chapter 21, there's a huge debate. Feel free to read in box commentary. He's going to walk you through 4 interpretations of what's going on there. Is it the Nazirite vow that Paul is participating in? Was he going to sacrifice in order to demonstrate that as a Jewish individual, he had been in association with Gentiles? So was it a purification sacrifice? Is that what's going on there? The text doesn't fully say, does it? Shake your head no, because it doesn't. Okay? It doesn't tell us. It just tells us that what he did in order to maintain his testimony within the Jewish believing community, and I would argue even in the Jewish community that was not believing in Jerusalem. Does that make sense? That he is continuing to adhere as best possible in Jewish tradition. So here's my question for you. In terms of Jewish practices and Jewish tradition that most Gentiles do not participate in, that are elements out of Mosaic teaching, the teachings of the Old Testament as we reference it, right? So out of the Hebrew Bible, what are those practices that either you maintain or you see in many believing Jewish communities in order to maintain their Jewishness and a faithful testimony even to the non-Yeshua believing Jewish community?
Well, it's the question is very challenging, actually, because to define the Messianic Judaism in this regard, or just to get an overview, it's probably the same difficult as to define the Christianity.
Yes.
There are many different expressions, and we have a joke that like 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So we have a number of opinions. In the Messianic movement, we have a broad spectrum from very almost orthodox observance through more liberal than any liberal Jew of today. So absolutely free evangelical Pentecostal charismatic Christian. So, and everything is in between is also there. So the spectrum is very broad. I can probably share the easiest for me is to share my perspective on that. That is also shared by some. I'm somewhere in this spectrum, probably somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. Nice, comfortable position, balance. I like the word. But for the Jewish people, believing in Jesus and to maintain their Jewish identity is a matter of covenantal fidelity with the God who has chosen, more than that, created Jewish people. So it's a matter of our fidelity and our faithfulness to the promises and covenants of God. More than that, the Jewish people are the testimony of God in this world, even when they don't believe in Jesus. Like, look at the Jewish people struggling. Look even at the troubles and Holocaust, and you will see and you will see the evidences of the Bible. See, and the blessing and survival of the Jewish people, you will see the evidences of God. And many theologians and philosophers in the past were using Jewish people as the evidence that God does exist. So the Jewish people as a visible ethnos, not just somewhere dispersed among the people, among other peoples and not visible, but as a visible people group, is a testimony that God exists, and also the testimony of Jesus' presence in this world in many ways. So for us, for Jewish believers, it's a matter of covenantal fidelity, and it's a matter of testimony of God, and to be His witnesses by keeping the Jewish identity, by keeping up our connection with the Jewish people. It can be done in many different ways of expressions, but we need to keep some core. And the core is like circumcision, probably very careful attitude regarding the law, and even identifying ourselves, not necessarily visibly, but vocally, and as testimony with the Jewish people. So when some Jewish people tell me you're not Jewish because you believe in Jesus, I strongly disagree with that, because that's not true. Well, in my personal life, as I became a believer in Jesus, all my life before that, I was whatever is there tastes nice. So I grew up as a liberal Jew. So Jewish identity, some Jewish traditions, but not more than if it bothers, why to keep it? But after I became a believer, a couple years later, working among Jewish people and ministering to them, I started thinking that it's probably very important for me to be identified as one. Because look, as I moved from the former Soviet Union, I became Russian. Because I'm originally from the Ukraine, from the former Soviet Union, so I'm Russian. And I was willing to show that not only ethnically I'm Jewish, I belong to these people. So I decided to put a kippah on my head, like a sign that I belong to these people. And then the very next thing that is happening to me, I'm on a road somewhere, and there is like a small snacks that are given to people, and there is a hot dog, and I tell to the lady who sells the hot dogs, I would like to get this hot dog. She looks at me and she says, but it's pork. And my first reaction was, why should I care? And then the next question in my head, why is she asking? And then, oops. I look like a Jew. So I said, thank you for telling me that. I came back home to my wife, and I told, probably we need to change our dietary, like our menu that we have. And she said, well, I was going to talk to you about that as well. So we changed that. So now I'm probably way more observant as a Jew as I used to be, and the holidays have much more meaning for me, and the worship style. So I identify myself with the Jewish people and with the covenant that God made with the Jewish people in the ways that I feel the most significant at the moment. Visibly, I present myself as a Jew, and I think that I follow Paul's example, not his prescription, but as his example. Also, I I keep the dietary restrictions that are very clearly indicated in the Bible. I keep the calendar that God clearly has given to the Jewish people, and things like that. And again, I'm doing that not because I just am under the burden of this, but because it's part of my testimony, Jewish testimony in this world, and because it's an expression of my faithfulness to the covenant with God together with my people Israel.
Well, I think that's chapter 21. If you were wrestling with that, put that context in reality and maybe even have it heightened because of that day and age. I mean, this dialogue between James and Paul, obviously this is not a salvific issue because salvation is in who? It's in Yeshua. And Paul clearly knew that. But in order to have an identity within the believing community, and I would say even with the non-Yeshua believing community. Remember, James uses that phrase about, look, there are thousands of Jews that have come to belief in Jesus. But in order to maintain that testimony within and without, I think that's helpful for us to see. And to be honest, that ties the whole book together. Because again, when you get back to chapter 28, why is Paul appealing to Caesar? What's the charge against him? It is coming up through that Jewish, non-believing, non-Yeshua believing group, through the religious system that is pressing him in saying that he has, in many ways, he has not been faithful to the tradition. And I think that Paul's charge, as my brother here has said, he would say, oh, I beg to differ. It's anything but that. In fact, it's just the opposite of that, because this Yeshua is the fulfillment of all covenants. So, Vladimir, thank you very much for your time today. That was very, very helpful as we wrap up the book of Acts, and I am thankful that unscripted, unrehearsed, you didn't even know you were going to be here just a few hours ago, but I am glad that you were able to pop in for this time. And friends, that concludes the book of Acts.